Good evening, everyone. I am Brooke Lament, the director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight. Thank you, as always, for your continued support of the Library and Museum, and thanks to our great partners at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. Today, we are commemorating the 50th anniversary of Gerald R. Ford becoming the 40th Vice President of the United States. This historic occasion was the first time the 25th Amendment to the Constitution was implemented. Following his swearing in at the Capitol in 1974, Ford had this to say: "I am indeed humbled to be the 40th Vice President of the United States, but I am proud, very proud, to be one of 200 million Americans. I promise my fellow citizens only this: to uphold the Constitution, to do what is right as God gives me to see the right, and within the limited powers and duties of the Vice Presidency, to do the very best I can for America." I think he did just that. So before I turn it over to Gleaves, I just want to do a quick reminder regarding our last event before the holiday. We hope to see you again next week, next Wednesday, for our Election Integrity Summit. And then please check our websites for upcoming events in January. We're going to have speakers Fred Johnson and Garrett Graff in January. So I'm going to turn it over to Gleaves.
Well, I am not surprised. All of you are in here because H.W. Brands is over there, and he's going to be up here in just a minute. And thank you for such a robust preview of what is to come. We had some great conversations today and in the last half hour leading up to this moment. So I think it's just wonderful to have all of you here. So Brooke and I are, I guess, into our source material because she read something from you. And I have to just say there's some things about December 6th that bear mentioning tonight. And this is a setup to part of Bill's talk, so if you'll indulge me, I want to point something out that President Ford writes in his autobiography about what was happening in this process of his becoming vice president. He says, "The FBI's investigation of me was the largest, most intensive probe that the Bureau had ever conducted into the background of a candidate for public office. Since October 13, some 350 special agents from 33 of the Bureau's field offices had interviewed more than 1,000 witnesses and compiled 1,700 pages of reports on Jerry Ford. So thorough was this probe, I discovered later that agents even interviewed a former football player from Union High School over here in Grand Rapids. More than 40 years before, during a game between Union and South High, I had tackled the man after the whistle had been blown and as a consequence had been ejected from the contest." He says the agent's question to that guy was Jerry Ford a dirty player? There are other things that he did. And finally then on November 27th, the Senate confirmed Ford by a vote of 92-3. And then as required by the 25th Amendment, you need both the Senate and the House to confirm his vice presidency. And then on December 6th, so 50 years ago today, the House followed suit by a vote of 387-35. He said, so you read a beautiful part of what he said. I'm going to read another little part that I had to scramble real fast after I heard what Brooke was doing. Gerald Ford said this: "I am a Ford, not a Lincoln. My addresses will never be as eloquent as Mr. Lincoln's, but I will do my very best to equal his brevity and his plain speaking." And then he says this, which is apropos of what Bill Brands is going to be talking about this evening. See if you could find somebody who would even speak like this today. He says, "As a man of the Congress, let me reaffirm my conviction that the collective wisdom of our two great legislative bodies will, in the end, serve the people faithfully and very well. Before I leave this house, which has been my home for a quarter century, I must say I am forever in its debt. And to you, Mr. Speaker, and to all of my friends here in both parties, I say a very fond farewell. What a man, what a mensch. Don't we need that tone today in Washington? First of all, yes, absolutely. First of all, somebody who can withstand that scrutiny from the FBI without saying, oh, it's been weaponized and all that. I mean, somebody who just, lived a clean life, served the people with integrity and character at the helm. So this leads to the segue to introduce Bill Brands, who's written this book on partisan founders. It's been, I think, sort of a running kind of a golden thread through U.S. history, that this country has had people who have fiercely fought one another in the trenches of politics, but only once did it really come to bad blows in the Civil War. And Bill has explored this topic with great expertise, great insight. And by way of introducing him, I just want to say, democratic societies go through their great eras, but you need great historians to interpret and write about the great eras. Bill Brands is one of those great historians, and I think for 3 reasons. There are many reasons, but I'm going to mention 3 real quickly. He's a tireless researcher. He digs and digs. He finds all the great quotations and actual source material to make the history come alive as though you're sitting in the room with the actors, the historical actors. Second, he's a gifted teacher. Everyone in this room who's been to Bill's lectures year in and year out, we've been bringing him back for 2 decades, knows what a gifted teacher he is and how he makes the history come alive for our generation with our questions and our needs. And I think also, he's a very disciplined and imaginative writer. You may not know, he puts out a book or 2 every year. Every one of them has a different flavor, a different tone, but they're imaginative in their treatment. And as a testimony to his imagination in history, he's written a book of haiku about American history. American history in haiku, to make you see it in a different way, to behold the object through the words. And I just learned when we had breakfast this morning that he's written a 2nd book of poetry about American history, which he's going to talk to us about tonight. No, just kidding. So please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Bill Brands to our stage.
Don't tempt me, Gleaves. I might actually talk about poetry tonight. Gleaves was kind enough not to share a major faux pas that I committed in the preparation for the event this evening. I think it was perhaps last year, shortly, maybe the day after the night after the visit or something like that, when he said, well, we'd like to have you come back next year. And next year will be the 50th anniversary of Gerald Ford's accession to the vice presidency. So maybe you could do something on the history of the vice presidency. And I thought about this, and at first I thought, vice president, I don't know, that's a tough one. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought it's a really interesting window on American history. It's a window that most people don't spend much time looking through. But if you look at the evolution of the vice presidency over time and who's held the office and what became of them and all this stuff, I thought, okay, this could be really good. And so I had been preparing to do this, and in my mind, I had a slideshow. I don't usually do slides, but I had a slideshow, and part of the slideshow was going to be, I was going to show you images of vice presidents, and I was going to give a prize to whoever could name any of them, because the vice presidency is one of the most often thankless jobs in American history. And so I was all prepared to do this. And then one day, I didn't tell you this part of the telephone conversation. I was in Austin, that's where I live, and there's a wonderful spring-fed pool in Austin called Barton Springs. And it's warm in Austin, deep into the autumn. And so I got your call. I was actually sitting at the side of Barton Springs, and Gleaves' call came in. And he said, Bill, I want to talk about what you're going to be talking about when you come to Grand Rapids in December. And there was a kind of quizzical tone in his voice. I thought, oh, geez, what is this? And he said, I thought you were going to talk about the vice presidency, but I got this description that you sent of your talk, and it seems like it's about something else. And immediately I realized what had happened. So I have this new book that's just out. It's called Founding Partisans, available for sale afterwards, and I'd be happy to sign them. And I had been doing lots of talks on the book. And so I guess maybe Lauren had asked me for the description, a brief description of the talk that he could use in the publicity he's sending out. And I got those talks mixed up with this talk. And so I sent him this capsule description of the book, which is all about the emergence of party politics in the United States in the 1780s and 1790s. So this comes to Gleaves, and he's thinking, this is what I'm going to talk about when I come in December. And it's just, all right, and Gleaves is so tactful. He didn't say, Bill, this isn't what you agreed to do. What are you thinking? And so it took me a while on the telephone to realize what the problem was, to realize that I had done this. And by the end of this, and Gleaves is generous enough to say, well, we could fit these two together, and we do want you to say something about Jerry Ford becoming vice president and the importance of that, but then you can talk about your book on the founding partisans. So it's typical of Gleaves to allow me to do that. And for my part, it was not particularly a problem. I'm sort of reminded of when Mark Twain, after Mark Twain became famous as an author, he made a nice living as a public speaker. And he would get on the train and he would tour from one place to another. And when he'd show up in a town, he would get off the train and he would be asked by the host committee, well, what are you going to talk on? And he would roll out this long list of titles. He'd say, the 35 titles here. And the host of the committee would be amazed. You can talk on all of those? He said, well, different titles, same talk. So in fact, Gleaves, you were always going to get this talk on the book. So my publisher would be disappointed if that weren't the case. No, but I am going to talk about the vice presidency, in part because Gerald Ford, as Gleaves pointed out, entered the vice presidency under unique circumstances. He was the first vice president to replace another vice president. There had been several, a dozen or so, former vice presidents who had vacated the office, several of them by death, some of them one by resignation, and some became president on the death of their predecessor, and the vice presidency was simply left vacant. But the 25th Amendment basically said, we don't want a vacant vice presidency. And one might very well ask, the Republic survived with vacant vice presidencies since the 1790s, so what's the big deal now? And it really gets at why the vice presidency was defined the way it was, what the vice president was expected to do, and how what actually happened defied that description and those expectations. So we do have to take it back to the beginning, and to the first vice president, John Adams. The vice presidency, well, first of all, the presidency was almost an afterthought at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And if you've read your Constitution, your pocket copy of the Constitution lately, you could pull it out if you want to check me on this. So actually, there is a story where I think it was Felix Frankfurter, who was, when he was on the Supreme Court, he was accosted when he was walking to the Supreme Court building by one of the reporters covering the Supreme Court, who asked him a question about something having to do with the Supreme Court. And Frankfurter reached into his back pocket for his pocket copy of the Constitution and discovered that he had left it at home. And he turned to the reporter and, as a matter of fact, he said, could you hand me your pocket copy of the Constitution? Thinking everybody carried one around. But anyway, in the Constitution, the vast majority of the Constitution is taken up by Article 1, which is all about Congress, the legislative branch. By the time the Constitutional Convention got around to Article 2, which is about the executive, they had pretty much run out of energy and run out of gas. They didn't really write this until almost the last 2 weeks of this 4-month convention that filled out the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. They were worn out, they were hot, the days before air conditioning. They were tired. They all wanted to get home. And they really didn't spend a lot of time on the presidency, in part because they'd run out of gas, in part because they thought that the president should be subordinate. I mean, it's not subordinate exactly. They were independent branches. But they thought that the initiative in the American government would rest with Congress. And indeed, this is one of the reasons why presidents of the 19th century are so unmemorable. That's by design. That wasn't a bug. That was a feature of the Constitution, because Congress was the place where all this stuff was going to happen. This is why the great heroes of American politics in the 19th century, people like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and John Calhoun, the titans of the Senate. So that's one of the reasons. The second reason is they'd run out of time. They didn't think the presidency was supposed to be such a big deal. And furthermore, they took comfort from the fact that they could look across the room at the Constitutional Convention and see George Washington. And they all knew that if he could be talked into it, George Washington would be the first president. And this is why the second article of the Constitution is really sketchy. It says how you qualify to be president, so what the qualifications are. You have to be 35 years of age. You have to be a natural-born citizen or a citizen at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. And And this because George Washington left after 2 terms. And this wasn't because George Washington was so modest that he said, okay, I shouldn't be president forever. He was so fed up with politics. They said, I'm out of here. I don't have to take this anymore. So, but the vice presidency, what's going on here? Well, they thought they needed a vice president because presidents might die. And in that day and age, people did die. People just kind of dropped dead. There was a horrible yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia during Washington's administration, where, in fact, Philadelphia just cleared out. Everybody who could leave did, and the people who didn't clear out mostly died. And so they knew that death could come suddenly, and they wanted to make sure that there was a president. I mean, there was somebody to fill in for the president. But the striking thing is that until a president died, nobody knew what happened when the president did die. Yes, the vice president steps in and acts as the president and assumes the responsibilities of the president, but would that vice president become the president? Would the vice president be the president upon the death? And this wasn't tested until William Henry Harrison died. And then John Tyler was vice president, but the question was, did he become president, or was he simply acting president? And Tyler insisted that he actually was the president. His opponents, the people who didn't like him, said, no, he's just acting. But one of the things that they discovered in politics, at least in American politics, if you act the part, you can be the part. They discovered it's really splitting hairs to no actual difference. If you simply act as president, if you have the responsibility as president, that's the important thing. Whether somebody says you actually are president is immaterial. And when Tyler carried it off, then we did reach this point where if a president died, the vice president became, to all intents and purposes, the president. But this was not actually formalized, not actually nailed down until the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment, which was also the one that said that we are going to appoint, the president will appoint, with the confirmation of the House in the Senate. In fact, it was the confirmation of the House, which was the second one to vote. That was December 6th, 50 years ago. That we will have a replacement vice president, and which is how Jerry Ford got the job. If he had come along 10 years earlier and this situation occurred, he wouldn't have gotten the job. We wouldn't be here tonight. There wouldn't be a Ford Museum. There wouldn't be a Ford Library, because Jerry Ford would not have been President of the United States, which raises another important aspect of the vice presidency. It's a door to the presidency in several instances for people who never would have become president, who never could have got elected in their own right. Gerald Ford is one example. He was a good leader of Congress, minority leader of the Republican Party, but he really didn't have presidential ambitions, and most people would have said he wasn't presidential timber, to use that old term. He didn't have the fire in the belly. Now, I've often thought that this is seen as something of a prerequisite to be president. And if you listen to reporting on this, they look at candidates, doesn't have fire in the belly. Well, what's fire in the belly? I mean, basically, it's, I gotta have this job. I gotta have this job. Many of you in the audience, you've hired people. Do you want people who think that life and death depends on getting this job? I mean, don't you often want to hire people who don't need the job, who are happy where they are? Else, I mean, Jerry Ford was in that position. He didn't need the presidency. There have been individuals, Richard Nixon was one, who sort of needed the presidency to confirm his self-worth. Bill Clinton was kind of that way, because, and people who run for president and make that their life's aim, they're that way, because when it comes right down to it, politics is a popularity contest. You put yourself out before the people, and you say, show me the love, vote for me. And if you have that kind of personality, then you will pursue the presidency as long as necessary to win it. But is that exactly who we want to be president? So it's something worth thinking about. But with this vice president, there's a vice president because the president might die. But the responsibilities of the vice president are just sketched in a sentence. And all the vice president is charged under the Constitution with doing is being president of the Senate, which puts the vice president in a strange position. We're so used to the idea that president, vice president, they run on the same ticket. They're part of the same administration. They come as a package deal. That was not the case at the beginning. It was not the case both under the terms of the Electoral College, but also because there really wasn't anything for the vice president to do in the early days. This is why he was made president of the Senate, which it just means presiding officer. He's the Senate's equivalent of the Speaker of the House. And by the way, in the early days of the Speaker of the House usually did not take part in debates. The Speaker of the House just banged the gavel like the Speaker of Parliament. And you just kind of as the traffic cop. And so this is what the vice president was supposed to do. And it was, in most cases, it was very boring. Oh, yes, the vice president has been allowed to break tie votes. But most of the time, you know well in advance whether it's going to be close. And so most of the time, vice presidents don't show up. They don't take that responsibility personally. Now, there's one good example of a vice president who did. Anybody know who I'm talking about? This person took that responsibility very seriously because the alternative was worse than boredom. This was Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was Thomas Jefferson's vice president. And it was the first time, in fact, that candidates had run as a ticket. If you vote for Jefferson, you vote for Burr. I'll get to that in a moment as to how this got complicated. But Burr very quickly got elbowed aside by Jefferson. So Burr was from New York, and he could deliver, and he did deliver, the New York electoral vote in the election of 1800. And the election of 1800 is critical in American history because it was the first time that power transferred from one party to the other party. In a new political system, getting the first election right is important, but the really crucial test of your system is the second election, or more precisely, the election when the incumbents lose. When the incumbents lose, do they leave peacefully? Do they say, yeah, we lost, we're out, we'll try to win it back, but we won't contest it? And this was why Thomas Jefferson called the election of 1800 the Revolution of 1800, because the incumbents, the Federalist Party of John Adams, lost to Jefferson's Republican Party. Anyway, so Jefferson was quite happy to have Burr bring the electoral vote of New York. But Jefferson didn't intend for Burr to have any role in the administration. Now, we think that vice presidents should have a role in an administration. And a president who makes use of a vice president is seen as, well, maybe making use of a talented person, Joe Biden under Barack Obama, perhaps, or maybe grooming a successor. Sometimes it works that way, sometimes it doesn't. But in the 1790s, in George Washington's day, in John Adams's day, in Thomas Jefferson's day, this was not the plan at all, because of the peculiar way in which vice presidents were originally elected. So in Article 2, as originally written, a president is chosen by the Electoral College. So far, so good. That's the way we still do it. And every elector had 2 ballots. Every elector still has 2 ballots. But originally, those 2 ballots were not distinguished between president and vice president. The electors just chose one person with 1 ballot, one person with the other ballot. The only requirement is that they cannot both be for a candidate from the same state as the elector. So the elector has to vote for at least one of the 2 people, not from his own state. Now, it sounds a little bit convoluted, but I'll explain it in a minute. But the thing is that the person who gets the most electoral votes becomes president. The vice president is the person who gets the second most electoral votes. Now, think about this for a minute. This is, the vice president is the loser to the president who won. So imagine, take any election of your memory for the person who won. So Al Gore would have been George W. Bush's vice president, and George McGovern would have been Richard Nixon's vice president. I mean, that's, okay, this is interesting. I guess we would have been spared Spiro Agnew and Gerald Ford. But anyway, so what this meant was the president, the winner, had no incentive to listen to the vice president, to consult the vice president, because the vice president probably had views that were diametrically opposite to the president. And furthermore, to cultivate the vice president, to make the vice president look good, would be not in the interests of the president or the people who supported him, because you'd just be grooming your successor as somebody who disagreed with you on the important issues. So this is why the first vice president, John Adams, complained he had been in office just weeks when he said, speaking of the vice presidency, he said, this is the most insignificant office in the history of mankind. You cannot imagine anything more insignificant than this. And he hardly knew what to do with himself. This question of what vice presidents do with themselves has been a chronic issue in American history. Theodore Roosevelt became vice president, and in his case, it was another one where there had been a vacancy. So William McKinley was elected in 1896, and his vice president died during McKinley's first term. So nobody did anything about it until McKinley was renominated in 1900. And then it was decided, well, we've got to run somebody for vice president. And Theodore Roosevelt was placed on the ticket over the objections of William McKinley, and especially his political boss, Mark Hanna. Now, over the objections of the top man on the ticket, really? Can they do that? Yes, they could. I'll say a little bit more about that, because again, it relates to how these vice presidents get to where they are. And the reason that Theodore Roosevelt was placed on the ticket in 1900 was that he had run afoul of the Republican boss of New York, a guy named Tom Platt, who had plucked Theodore Roosevelt out of obscurity. Roosevelt had been a state legislator in New York, but he had gotten on the wrong side of the Republican political machine in the state of New York, run by Tom Platt. But Tom Platt, initially, after Roosevelt came home heroically after the Spanish-American War, he was brought in, said, "You want to be governor?" And Roosevelt, "Sure, I'd be happy to be governor." And so they ran him for governor, and it was one of those khaki elections where he ran in his Rough Rider uniform, and fellow Rough Riders would come along, and cheer for him at each political rally. And so he won the governorship of New York, but he then proceeded to initiate reforms that really annoyed boss Tom Platt. And so Platt says, how can I rid myself of this turbulent priest or turbulent vice president? And he said, okay, I know, we'll make him vice president and he'll never be heard from again. And that really was the way the vice presidency was viewed, except that Mark Hanna, McKinley's political advisor boss, said, "Don't you realize that there is just one life between that madman and the White House?" He was referring to Roosevelt. And of course, McKinley was assassinated and Roosevelt became president. But Roosevelt's another example of someone who never could have become president on his own. Now, you might think this is odd because Theodore Roosevelt, was the most powerful vote getter since Andrew Jackson. He was the first vice president to be subsequently elected on his own, first vice president who became president, and then to be elected in his own right. And that's what really gives you legitimacy. A vice president, until he faces re-election or election and wins, then he's usually considered, he's lacking a mandate. And some people will think of him as mildly, at least, illegitimate. This was the treatment given to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was another one who never could have been elected president on his own. In Johnson's case, it was because he was from a state in the Jim Crow South. And American voters as a whole would not accept a Southern president. Now, there had been Southerners all over the presidency, from Washington through Zachary Taylor, but the Civil War happens and there's not a single Southerner from then until Lyndon Johnson. And this caused America to be caught in a catch-22 regarding the system of segregation. Because like many things in life, people don't like to be lectured to by outsiders. Members of your family can say, sit up and act right. But if somebody from outside the family says, then the family all pulls together, you can't tell us how to do things. And the South was very much that way. There were many people in the South who thought, this Jim Crow system, it's outdated, we've got to get rid of it. But the people that had been pressing them to get rid of it were outsiders. John Kennedy, for example. Massachusetts, Yankee, liberal, is going to tell the South how to organize this thing. So Kennedy persuaded members of Congress to sponsor a civil rights bill in 1963, but it got nowhere as long as it was Kennedy pushing it. But then Johnson becomes president after Kennedy's assassination, and then Johnson can say, speaking as a Southerner, and when Johnson would make this case, he put on his Southern drawl. Johnson was from Texas. And Texans, especially from the hill country where Johnson was from, they can talk two ways. They can talk Western. George W. Bush talked Western, especially when he was back home in Texas. When he was in Washington, he talked Ivy League. But Johnson could talk Western out of one side of his mouth, but he could talk Southern out of the other side of his mouth. And he could tell Southerners, okay, it's time to drag our region into the 20th century. But so there was, as I say, there was this catch-22. Until there was a Southern president, then the South wouldn't reform. But there wouldn't be a Southern president until the South reformed. So the only way Johnson could ever become president was through the side door of having been vice president. And then he could accede to the presidency on the death of John Kennedy. So the vice presidency has served that kind of purpose. It opens things up to people, occasionally it opens things up to people who never would have been president otherwise. Theodore Roosevelt is considered one of the great presidents in American history. He wouldn't have been president without the vice presidency and without the death of his predecessor. Lyndon Johnson, certainly one of the great figures of the 20th century, the one most responsible for ending the Jim Crow system and reforming civil rights in this country, also responsible for Vietnam, which would have to be a minus on the side, but influential nonetheless. Somebody who would not have been president without this strange system we have for vice presidents. Now, this also connects to something that, well, which is at the heart of the book that I'm promoting. And that is the something that took the framers by surprise. And that is the emergence of political parties. So, when you read the writings of Benjamin Franklin, of James Madison, leave Alexander Hamilton out of this part of it, John Adams, the idea that parties would emerge in Republican America was both a disappointment and a shock. They had known political parties. In fact, in every colony, there had been political parties. In Pennsylvania, where Franklin was from, there was the party of the proprietors of the Penn, William Penn family, from whom Pennsylvania is named. And then there was the Popular Party. But the parties were usually sort of the people of the colony kind of against the crown. And the thinking was, if you take the crown out of this, then we won't have these parties. And furthermore, the experience that Americans went through during the Revolutionary War caused this feeling that we're really all in this together. We've kind of concluded that we all have the same interests, and it worked out this way. I wrote a book a while back, I think I spoke about it here, or maybe this was on Zoom when we did it, about the Revolutionary War that the book is called Our First Civil War. And I point out that there was a deep division of opinion in this country during the Revolutionary War. The short version of the American Revolution, Americans get upset with British oppression, British laws that they don't like. They rise up, toss out the British, and up pops George Washington, and here we go. But it wasn't like that at all. There was a deep split of opinion in the country during the American Revolutionary War between the ones that were called the Patriots or the Loyalists, or the Whigs and the Tories. And the Loyalists were as numerous at the beginning of the war as the Patriots. The rebels are the ones who want independence. The Loyalists said, forget it. You know, the British Empire isn't perfect, but it's better than the alternatives, so let's stick with that. And the bloodiest fighting, the nastiest fighting in the American Revolutionary War was not between British and Americans. It was between Americans and Americans, between the Patriots and the Loyalists. And this is often the case with civil wars, because if you fight somebody from a foreign country, you really don't have anything personal against them. But if you fight against somebody you know, then it does get personal. And this war between the American Patriots and the American Loyalists was deeply personal. But here's what caused the winners in the war to think our divisions are over. At the end of the war, and this doesn't happen in a lot of places, it didn't happen in the French Revolution, which is one of the reasons the French Revolution became so bloody in a way that the American Revolution did not. At the end of the American Revolution, the losers left. The Loyalists basically got on the British ships and sailed away. Most of them wound up in Canada. Some went to the West Indies. Some went to England. Some went to West Africa. So imagine if you were George Washington, or Alexander Hamilton, who was Washington's aide during the Revolutionary War, or James Madison, who was in the Virginia legislature and in the Continental Congress, or Thomas Jefferson, who was governor of Virginia during this time. So these were all on the side of independence. And at the end of the war, they saw that the people that they had disagreed with so violently were all gone. So the only people left were these good guys, the ones who had been in favor of independence. So at that point, it was not implausible to think, okay, we're all going to agree. And especially since they had created these new governments, these Republican governments, where they thought that a lot of the problems originated with the monarchy and King George. And when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he points the finger of blame not at Parliament, not the elected officials, but at King George. Now, this was sort of a politically motivated attack on King George. It's a lot easier to get upset at a single villain than at a whole bunch of villains. So to personify evil, or for that matter good, is a convenient literary device, and Jefferson made use of it. And so there was this thinking, we got rid of our king, we got rid of those bad loyalists, so now, we're all good Republicans here, and we can all agree. And so Benjamin Franklin, for example, was one. James Madison was another, who said that a republic will rise or fall on the virtue of its citizens. Civic virtue, this idea that people are willing to put the interests of the country, of the community, as a whole before their own self-interests or before the interests of a faction. That was the term they used for parties. And so they really did think, maybe. I'm split on this. I wrote this book about it, and I can't decide if they sort of believed their own press clippings, like the Declaration of Independence, or if they were, or were they deluding themselves, or were they just sort of speaking for effect? But they all spoke as though there won't be any parties here in America. And if there are, we will figure out ways to suppress them. Parties are this bad thing. And at first it started out, it seemed that way. Well, except that the first try at an American national government, the Articles of Confederation, didn't work. Well, at least it didn't work to the satisfaction of groups, people, who thought, we need a strong central government. Now, the Articles of Confederation gets a bad rap in history because it was relatively quickly overthrown. But the idea that the states were sovereign and they would unite in this confederation where they would cooperate in the confederation, but they would not yield sovereignty to the confederation. So this is a model that has been adopted in other times and places. It was the model adopted by the Confederacy, the Confederate States. Maybe that's not such a good example. It's a model adopted by the European Union. It's the model adopted by the United Nations. But it didn't suit the tastes of individuals who thought we need a stronger central government, starting with Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Now, one of the striking things about this part of the story is that during this period, Hamilton at the beginning of the Revolutionary War was a nobody. Nobody had heard of him. He was this orphan from the West Indies, and he was an illegitimate kid. So he came to America in his young teens, and he had to make his way by wit, by intelligence, by ambition, by the ability to ingratiate himself to powerful men, people who could, we would call it networking. And so he could network. And he would make himself useful to people like, oh, I don't know, let's just pick somebody out of the air. George Washington. I know, let's do that. And Hamilton was really good at this. But Hamilton, so I begin the sort of the main part of my book with Alexander Hamilton complaining about the lack of patriotism in Congress. Now, this is the Congress of the Confederation, and about their refusal to give the Army what it needs, and how we need to make these big changes. And this is Alexander Hamilton, who is all of 27 years old. And James Madison, at this point, is a member of Congress. He's been a member of the Virginia legislature, and he agrees. And Madison is in his early 30s. And so here are these two young guys who take it upon themselves to do nothing less than topple the government of the United States. They have convinced themselves that the Articles of Confederation are entirely inadequate to the needs of the country. We need a stronger central government. This competition of state against state, this idea that the states are sovereign, this will never do. If this country is going to hold together, then we need to get a stronger government at the center. So they begin this campaign to undermine, to bring down the government of the United States. Now, you don't usually read about it in these terms because we have become so beguiled by the success of the Constitution of 1787, often forgetting that that was a mulligan. You know, that was the second try. The first tee shot went out of bounds. Now, we're not going to count that one. Let's go back and hit it again. But what they did is they had to get rid of this original Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. So what they did was they got together and they started, well, if they were doing it today, they would go on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or something, and they would just start promoting this new idea. And the new idea sounds innocuous when they start. They say, we want to gather people who are sympathetic to our plan, and we are simply going to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. Now, this sounds pretty innocuous because the Articles of Confederation, to be amended, required the unanimous vote of all 13 states. So anybody could say, all right, well, we'll listen to what you're offering. And if we don't like it, if we in Rhode Island don't like it, if we in Virginia don't like it, we just say no, and that's that. That's the end of it. So they issue a call for a convention. And the convention is to be held in Annapolis in the autumn of 1786. Oh, and they say, we're going to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation on the subject of trade. They really get specific about what they're going to be talking about. There's just, a few things. We think, for example, that a tariff war between New York and New Jersey is not a good idea. So, okay, and a lot of people could say, well, that's pretty reasonable. So people thought, all right, well, yeah, maybe something will come of this. But it turned out nothing did come of it because they called the convention. What do you do if you call a convention and nobody comes? And that's basically what happened. A few people came, but nowhere near a quorum. And so they could not credibly say, okay, we're going to go forward. But this is a moment that demonstrated the political aptitude and the ability to think on their feet of Hamilton and Madison. So they said, well, actually, this wasn't really going to be the convention. This was just a preliminary convention. The real convention is going to take place next spring. We're going to do it in Philadelphia. And not everybody believed this. Hey, boy, so embarrassed, and why should we pay any more attention to it next time around? And then something happened that made all the difference in the world. And this is a reminder of the role of accident in history. And often when you think about these early periods, it certainly has been portrayed by 4th of July speakers and the like, think, it was foreordained that it was going to work out this way. And it demonstrates maybe that God was smiling on America, or that these were giants of history or something like that, and success was inevitable. It wasn't inevitable at all. What made it work was that between the Annapolis failed convention and the second try, the Mulligan, in Philadelphia, there was a rebellion that broke out in western Massachusetts among farmers who couldn't pay their debts. And the farmers, led by a guy named, a Revolutionary War veteran named Daniel Shays, said, okay, we're not going to pay our debts, and we're not going to observe court judgments that say that we need to do this. And this alarmed the one person whose alarm meant everything for all of this. And that one person was George Washington, who had retired from command of the Continental Army. He went back to Mount Vernon thinking his days in public life were over. But then he reads about this rebellion in Massachusetts, and he learns about it because James Madison, fellow Virginian, writes him letters saying, have you learned all the alarming stuff that's going on in Massachusetts? And Washington was a man who, I won't say he was obsessed, he was perhaps preoccupied with order, keeping things in order, which is kind of ironic for somebody who blew up the British Empire. But once he'd blown up the British Empire, he wants to make sure that the successor state holds together. So Washington agrees to go to the Philadelphia Convention, and all of a sudden, that gave legitimacy to the undertaking of Madison and Hamilton. But still, everybody comes thinking and having been authorized by their states to go to this convention to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. Again, a proposed amendment is harmless because unless there's unanimity, it just falls dead. But as soon as people show up in Philadelphia, Hamilton and Madison close the doors, lock the doors, and they say, hey, we were just kidding. We're not simply going to amend the Articles of Confederation. We're getting rid of the Articles of Confederation. We're throwing that book out the window. And we're going to write a whole new Constitution. Now, I ask myself, these are sincere people. These are people who think they have the national interest, the public interest at heart. How do they explain this to themselves? Because clearly they have misled the country. They have misled the people sent to Philadelphia. So what they do is they write into this new Constitution that this new Constitution will take effect when 9 of the 13 states sign on. So this is a voluntary thing. If we put this Constitution out to the country and the country rejects it, then, okay, we wasted 4 months of our lives, we'll never get back, but that's that. Except that once they send it out, then they mount this ferocious campaign to ratify this Constitution, which is when the first parties in America originate. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this, but I'll point out it's often been asked. So why is partisanship so striking, so marked, so bitter in the United States? And in the first place, I would say, well, it seems that way if those are the only parties you know. But parties in other countries have been just as bad as parties in the United States. I will point out that we think of partisanship today as being particularly bitter and zero-sum. That's true enough. But in this early time, people got shot and killed in duels over politics. It was politics. It was a party difference that led to the infamous duel between Burr and Alexander Hamilton. So we're not there yet. But why do we have parties? Why are there parties at all? Well, the first reason is, and this is the one that you kind of hit your head and ask, didn't they see this one coming? You have parties when you have differences of opinion. And in any group of people, there will be differences of opinion, especially when you're talking about important issues of public affairs. We don't all agree. Now, I mentioned earlier that after the Loyalists left at the end of the Revolutionary War, there was this moment where they all agreed. And they thought that they all agreed on other stuff too. But it's human nature that if you have this one problem and you solve that problem, you might momentarily think, all my problems are over. No, by tomorrow you've got a new problem to worry about. Your problems kind of rise to the top. And so this is what happened. There were disagreements over, for example, the relative weight given to the states vis-a-vis the central government. And in the Articles of Confederation, the balance was in favor of the states. In this new Constitution, the balance was in favor of the federal government. So this was at the heart of the first party system. Oh, and I will add this, that in politics, votes invariably come down to a yes or no decision. When a bill is up for consideration, you either vote yes or you vote no. When Gerald Ford's nomination to be Vice President of the United States is up for consideration, you don't get, A, B, C, D, and E. You just get, true or false, yes or no. So politics usually comes down to a binary choice, yes or no. And on any issue, there's a strong tendency for people who are in favor of the thing to group together. Now, they might have different reasons for being in favor of it, but it makes perfect sense to gather together. And it makes perfect sense for the others to gather on the other side. Now, there is something that makes two parties, this is the basis for the two-party system in the United States, and it's different from countries like Israel, countries like Germany, countries that have proportional representation. Because in our system, you don't get a seat in Congress, you don't get a seat in any state legislature, you don't win any office unless you can gather basically 51% of the vote. There are some exceptions, but this is the basic rule. In countries that have proportional representation, if your party, if all your candidates together get, let's say, 15% of the vote, then you are apportioned 15% of the seats in the House or whatever House we're talking about. And so over time, you can build from 5% to 10% to 15% to eventually maybe you'll take over. Like the National Socialist Party was the plurality party in Germany in 1933. And so this is the way it works, but not in the United States. Until you can get 51% of the vote, you're nothing. And this is why third parties in the United States have only been they're these momentary things. And they pop up for a single election, and sometimes they spoil the election, sometimes they raise an issue that one of the other parties steals and runs with it, but they never last because of the way our Constitution is written. And we're going to go to questions in just a moment, but I'm going to sort of leave you with this thought about our party system. I started writing this book I started thinking about this book some years back, and I was certainly aware of the partisanship that infects perhaps American politics these days. And when I do a historical book, I sort of immerse myself in an earlier era. It's like traveling in time. And so when I come back, when the book is done, I sometimes speak as though I've been to the past and I've returned. And I usually have bad news and good news. So I can say that about this book. I've been to the past and I return to the present with bad news and good news. The bad news is that the partisanship we're experiencing today is not going away. It's been with us from the very beginning. And if it's lasted from the 1790s until now, we would be fooling ourselves to think that somehow if we just make a change here, a change there, or we all act nicer toward each other, it's going to go away. It's not. Until we all agree on all the important issues, there are going to be parties. So the bad news is partisanship is with us, and if you're hoping it's going to disappear, you're going to be disappointed. The good news, however, is that we've been living with it for 200 years, and it hasn't killed us yet. So it's probably not going to kill us. So with that thought, we'll turn to questions. So there are microphones coming around. So if you have a question, raise it, and somebody will hand you a microphone. Here's somebody.
Probably the worst situation for a vice president was Harry Truman's succession under FDR. And the issue that doesn't get written about much in the many historical books that have been written on the subject is why was FDR so reticent to share any information at all with Truman, and of course the epitome of that being the atomic bomb.
Yes. So the question, if you didn't get all of it, was vice presidents who become president on the death of a predecessor are sometimes not very well prepared. And Harry Truman is the best example of this, because Harry Truman had met with Franklin Roosevelt just once between the day of their joint inauguration. Roosevelt again as president and Harry Truman as vice president. He was not part of Roosevelt's inner circle. Roosevelt confided almost nothing in Harry Truman. Harry Truman was certainly not even Roosevelt's first choice. Harry Truman was placed on the ticket in 1944 because there was revolt in the Democratic Party against the incumbent vice president, Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was sort of the last of the hardcore New Dealers. And the Democratic Party had pretty much veered away from that. There's something else that goes on that's involved here, and that is, if you think that the Republicans were tired of Franklin Roosevelt as president, the Democrats were as tired as the Republicans were in many cases. Because if you are an ambitious Democrat, and every politician above a certain level is ambitious, when they look in the mirror, every Democrat in Congress, certainly every Democrat in the Senate looks in the mirror and sees a president smiling back at him. But you sort of have to wait your turn. You cannot challenge an incumbent president. And so Roosevelt, there was a line of Democrats who thought that Roosevelt would have to leave in time for the 1940 election to get 2 terms. But he stuck around. He got elected. And then he got elected again. And it looked like Roosevelt was never going to step aside. And people like John Nance Garner, his first vice president, they just gave up. And Garner went back to Texas. And so there was this revolt. Oh, and this is where Gerald Ford shares something with Harry Truman, and those two are about the only one who fit this category. Most vice presidents have to assume that they are not going to become president, at least not until they earn election on their own. Because most presidents survive their 4 or 8 years in office. The number of presidents who die in office, there have been several, but most of them have survived. And so Harry Truman had reason to think that Franklin Roosevelt would not survive his 4th term. And maybe this is one of the reasons that Franklin Roosevelt did not confide in him, because Roosevelt really looked like death warmed over when he ran in 1944. His personal physician publicly perjured himself. I guess technically he wasn't under oath, but he lied. He certainly broke his Hippocratic oath or something, by telling the American people the president is in robust good health. He was not. And it was not surprising to anybody who knew Roosevelt that Roosevelt died just 3 months into his 4th term. And Harry Truman might have been aware of that. And that, by the way, this fact that Roosevelt might die in the 4th term is one of the reasons for this revolt against Henry Wallace, because we're going to be stuck as president with whoever is vice president. And of course, this is one of the concerns among people who are concerned in this direction about President Biden's advanced age. And you can bet that assuming Biden gets the nomination and Kamala Harris is still on the ticket, the Republicans will say, you know, a vote for Joe Biden for president is actually a vote for Kamala Harris for president. And, you know, people might or might not believe it. But Harry Truman had some reason to believe that he would become president, which is what makes it all the more striking that Franklin Roosevelt didn't bring him in. But try to imagine, when I teach my students, I very often say, try to imagine you're in this person's shoes, because I think I've sometimes presented this as the historian's superpower. The historian's superpower is the ability to see the world through other eyes, because this is what we do. We look at people in the past, we try to find out all we can about them, and we try to find out what the world looked like to them. And I point out to my students, I mean, I'm not making a particular case that your best career choice is to become a history major. But I will say that it will serve you well in any career, and just in life, to get used to the idea of looking at the world through somebody else's eyes. Because you don't have to agree with that worldview, but if you are able to make that imaginative leap, you will know more about the world, and you'll have a greater ability to deal with people. But anyway, so if Roosevelt says, I'm gonna die, therefore I have to brief Harry Truman and bring him every day, I could certainly imagine Roosevelt thinking, that's almost inviting death to come sooner. And nobody wants to do that. There's another thing, and this really goes back to the earliest days of the vice presidency, when the vice president was indeed the foe of the president. I didn't mention here, but after 3 times of this, then the Constitution was rewritten, and the 12th Amendment changes the way that presidents and vice presidents are chosen. So now every elector still has 2 ballots, but now one of them says president, and the other one says vice president. So it's really clear which is which. But anyway, so back in the days of John Adams, well, I didn't mention. So John Adams was vice president for 2 terms to George Washington. George Washington kind of remained above party, even though he was a closet Federalist. But in the election of 1796, the 2 parties were arrayed against each other. John Adams, the Federalist candidate, Thomas Jefferson, the Republican candidate. Adams wins, Jefferson loses. Now, Adams does not, and is not going to bring Jefferson into his circle of advisors, because Jefferson believes just the opposite of what Adams does. And so he has no incentive to build up his vice president. But that is even true of presidents, some presidents, with their vice presidents of their own party. Because the last thing a president wants is to be overshadowed by his vice president. If any of you have younger siblings, you will have this, at some time or other in your life, you've had this experience when you're younger. In my case, I've got a younger brother. And when you're 6 and he's 3, you're king of the hill. And a 3-year-old does not challenge a 6-year-old. When you get to be 16 and 13, a little bit closer. When you get to be 20 and 17, uh-oh. Now you don't get in a wrestling match so readily with your younger brother. And so there is this sense that you sort of don't want to encourage these people who might overshadow you. And this is one of the reasons, this is one consideration that presidential candidates make in choosing vice presidential candidates. Because it's a tough thing to have sufficient self-confidence to choose as your running mate somebody who is better qualified, somebody who's more charismatic, someone who is a more appealing candidate than you. You look bad by comparison. And this explains some of the, if you ask me, this explains some of the really weird choices of vice presidential candidates over the year. What was he thinking? Well, anyway, so there's that. I think that's part of the reason. But, of course, what it means is that Harry Truman came into office exceedingly unprepared. You've probably heard the saying that God smiles on drunks and the United States of America. Because the evidence of this is, at moments of crisis, we've lucked into these good presidents, probably presidents who were better than we deserved. There was no reason to think that Abraham Lincoln had the strength of character, had the insight into human nature that he did, had the steel to be able to wage a war that would lead to the deaths of 700,000 Americans in pursuit of what? An ideal. I mean, not something material, not something like territory. It was this ideal of democratic self-government and to persuade people to do it. Most people thought when Franklin Roosevelt died, my God, Harry Truman? Are you kidding me? This is a critical moment in world history, and we get Harry Truman. Truman himself was overwhelmed. He said he felt as though the sun, the moon, and the stars had fallen on him. And he went to talk to Eleanor Roosevelt and offer his condolences. And he said, and good Midwesterner that he was, he said, if I can do anything for you, I'm here to help. And Eleanor Roosevelt said to him, Harry, you're the one who needs help now. But it turned out that Harry Truman was a really good president for that moment. And, if it could have been otherwise. Now, in fact, at times it was otherwise. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson became president, there could not have been a worse president for the country. But again, you could sort of step back and say, yeah, God's still smiling on the United States. You know the story? This is told in Boccaccio's Decameron about the Jew who wants to convert to Christianity. Do you know the story? Okay. So he wants to convert to Christianity. He consults some of his Christian friends. And he says, I want to convert to Christianity. But before I do, I want to go see the Pope. And I want to, see the top guy and see how this system works. And the Christians all say, no, this is back in the Renaissance times. And when the popes are up to no end of shenanigans. They're having children and all this other stuff. And they say, oh, God, no, don't go to Rome. Don't see the Pope. Because, no, you don't need to go. You don't need to go. He says, I know, I'm going to go. I'm going to go. So off he goes. And some while later, weeks or months later, he comes back. And they're all really interested. Well, what did you see in Rome? What did you do? He said, well, I've converted. I'm a Christian now. Are you kidding me? So what did you see in Rome? He said, you wouldn't believe what I saw in Rome. I saw cardinals acting in the most scandalous ways. I saw offices of the church being bought and sold. I saw the offspring of bishops claiming the right to this and that. And you still wanted to become a Christian? And he said, yeah, I figured that any religion that could survive that kind of misbehavior must be the real thing. And so another way you can interpret America's ability to survive the Andrew Johnsons of its history and all the shenanigans of all the people who've held office is, well, if we're still here after all that time, maybe somebody is smiling on us. Other questions?
Working. As an historian, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the notion that if Trump becomes president again, that we could lose our democracy?
So the first thing that I will say is, as a historian, I deal with the past. I don't deal with the future. And then to that, I will add that although I cannot tell you what's going to happen next year, after it does happen, I will be able to tell you why whatever did happen was inevitable. So this is what we do. So I'll be a little bit more serious. And I will say that we are approaching a fork in the road. Now, of course, there's always a fork in the road, and I say that the election of 2024 could go one of two ways. And let's just assume for the sake of this question, this argument, that President Joe Biden is running against former President Donald Trump. And let's suppose Donald Trump wins, and let's suppose that he does act on some of the statements that he's recently made. saying that he's going to go after his enemies, and he's going to use the Justice Department against the people who opposed him the way he says it's been used against him. Now, let's suppose that the scenario that says, in fact, you perhaps read, there was a piece by Robert Kagan in the Washington Post in the last week, where he says, don't kid yourself. I mean, he's speaking to sort of fellow liberals. Don't kid yourself. Trump dictatorship is just around the corner. Now, if in fact that turns out to be true, then I and other historians will be able to look at the path from, let's say, 2015 through 2016, through 2020, through January 6, 2021, and we say, okay, we saw it coming. Okay, there it was. That's the evidence. Okay? Now, if in fact it doesn't turn out that way, let's suppose that Donald Trump loses the election, and then he finally decides to retire for good to Mar-a-Lago. I've sometimes thought, oh man, what if he loses, but he doesn't retire, and he's coming back another 4 years from now? I mean, that's almost, oh gosh. But anyway, but the thing is, the real question is, which way, when we come to this fork in the road, which way are we going to go? And I don't know. I don't have any more insight in this to anybody else. But I would say that almost either way it goes, I'll be able to trace some precursors. But the thing is, until we know, I don't know which path we're going to take. That is up to you and you and you and you and all the voters in this country. And I don't have any more insight in their behavior than anybody else. It's up to Donald Trump, assuming he wins. It's up to everybody else who's involved. And I have no more insight into the future than anybody else. But after it happens, then you can see, okay, we should have seen it coming. And I don't say this by any means to liken Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler. But Hitler's another one where, after it happened, people said, you should have seen it coming. Because he became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. And this because his was not a majority party in the Reichstag, but he was the plurality party. And he had this, we'll call it a campaign document, Mein Kampf. And this is my struggle. This is what we're going to do. But is he just sort of talking through his head? Is this just campaign blather? Is he really going to do it? Well, at the time it was easy to say, the responsible folks in Germany, they'll put him in his place after a while. And he's such a buffoon. He says these strange things. He looks like Charlie Chaplin. And, so how can you take him seriously? Well, so now that we know how it turned out, you go back and say, boy, if the people of Germany, if the responsible people in Germany had stood up to Hitler in 1934, 1935, if the former Allied powers from World War I had said, no, you don't get to reoccupy the Rhineland. No, you don't get to rebuild the German military. No, you do have to pay those war debts and all that stuff. If they had enforced the Treaty of Versailles, when he was weak, then things would have changed. The real hinge point for this argument is the Munich Conference of 1938, when Hitler had demanded part of Czechoslovakia, which really would have changed the boundary. It's basically, he demanded of Czechoslovakia what Vladimir Putin has demanded of Ukraine. And the thinking was, and this has been American thinking and thinking of the Western powers since then, that if they could have stood up to Hitler at Munich, but they didn't. If they had, subsequent history would have been different. But they didn't take him that seriously because he said, okay, this is all we're going to do. I won't ask for anything else. Now, it turns out he was lying, but you don't know until it happens. And so I'm not going to tell you that Donald Trump's going to be a dictator, and I can tell you he's not going to be a dictator. But I will tell you that if he does, and even what does it even mean for somebody to be a dictator in American circumstances? Are we simply going to have a one-party system, and Democrats will be rendered illegal? By the way, one of the things that I pointed out when I talk about partisanship is the only thing worse than competitive party politics is no competitive party politics. If you don't like partisanship, what's the alternative? A one-party government. And that's even worse. You don't want that. So no, I don't know what the answer is, but I think that there's enough evidence that you can make a sensible argument for both ways, depending once we know which way it goes. And so the last thing on this is, if I really could predict the future, I wouldn't simply be a historian. I'd go to Wall Street and I would have retired long ago. But this comes up again and again in history. So it's one of the hardest things to get across to students, and it just sort of ordinary folks looking at history. You know, why didn't Lyndon Johnson know that escalating the war in Vietnam was a bad idea? That the United States didn't have the stamina to carry it out? Well, because smart money in the United States, smart money in the world said the United States, even, you know, at half throttle, can beat this fourth-rate military power North Vietnam. But it didn't turn out that way. And so there's a temptation. I have to drill this into my graduate students. There's this strong temptation for people to sort of look down on the past, look down on people of the past as either sort of ignorant or benighted or something. Why didn't they see that? And with my graduate students, you know, they're at an age and they're sort of in a context where they all want to be, you know, the smartest person in the room. And so it's tempting for them to say, well, okay, Johnson's such a dummy, or, you know, Nixon a dummy to think he could get away with Watergate, or all this stuff. You know, but it's easy for you to say knowing how it turned out. When you don't know how it turned out, then it's a lot harder to say. And I say, well, if you're so smart, you know, tell me where the Dow Jones average is going to be 6 months from now. And if you know, then put your money there, and we'll see. Do we have time for another question, or is it we're run out?
I think we ought to wrap it up so you can start signing books. Don't you wish you'd had this guy in high school history, college history? Bill, as a token of our appreciation, this is both on behalf of the library and the museum and from the foundation, we'd like to give you a gift. And we so appreciate all the enlightenment and the humor and all the ways that you have taught us, because you are a master teacher. And we expect you to come back next year and get your assignment right from the start.
He knows what the assignment is. He's gotten a sneak preview of what's next.
That's right. So I just want to say thanks to all of you who are here. And if you look at the program tonight, you just turn that program over. You see a number of institutions and individuals that make tonight's program possible. We are in a community. It takes community to pull off these great programs. And I'd like for you just to take a look at it. You'll see not only our foundation, but you'll see the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum. Brooke, thank you so much for your partnership in these kinds of evenings. Appreciate that. You also see that there have been several people who made this evening possible. The Secchia Family Foundation, the Hillary and Connie Snell Freedom Fund, and John and Michelle Engler. In fact, I see Hillary Snell right over there. Hillary, thank you so much for all you did to bring this to us today. And also, it is always delightful when we have members of the Ford family who are with us. And where are you? Please raise your hand. Yes, there we go. We have two generations of the Ford family. We have Greg Ford and we have his son, Zach. Thank you so much for your continuing participation. Now, Bill's going to be signing books. But before he does, we're going to have a couple of photographs up here. Let the photographs take place, and then he'll go to the lobby to sign books. Thanks for a great evening being here, being a great audience. Drive home safely.